Indigo. Written by Claire Fitzpatrick. Narrated by Benjamin Orchard. Featuring incidental music by Kevin MacLeod. Prologue. Rob saw Indigo's feet first, toes almost translucent as they tiptoed the cool granite tiles. His eyes travelled upwards. Her figure seemed like a grotesque replica of the woman he knew. Her pallid nakedness, lifeless arms, and neck bent impossibly to one side. Her thick, garish silver rings looked like weights on her lifeless fingers. Her familiar face seemed almost alien. The light from the hallway cast an eerie, yellowish pall over her skin, giving it a jaundiced, sickly look. It receded into shadow next to the upturned chair. Rob opened and closed his mouth soundlessly, like a fish. He had bought the extension cord for her last week and left it on the dining room table. He took a step backwards and reached for his phone in his pocket. He fumbled with it for a few moments until it slid from his fingers and fell to the kitchen floor, screen cracked. He glanced down at the broken phone, then back up at Indigo. Shit. Chapter 1. The wake was held at a friend of a friend's. The solemnity and judgment overpoweringly unpleasant. Nobody wanted to say the word. Suicide. It seemed like a curse word, something that would invoke the wrath of the gods and bring forth an apocalyptic doom if uttered just once. Suicide. This was Rob's third friend to succumb. It was like that in the arts. You always knew at least one person who killed themselves, or knew of them in a way. Two and you were just unlucky. First it had been Elle, young, vivacious Elle. She had coordinated the first theatre troupe Rob had been a part of. One day she was there, the next she was found in a park. Then it had been Antoinette. They hadn't spoken in months, but he'd kept up with her on social media. One day she posted about a TV show. 3 days later, her memorial was confirmed. Rob had overdosed before, just once 6 months earlier. He hadn't even thought of what might have happened had he actually died. One day he was in the hospital, the next he was back at work, and life had gone on. He had pushed the incident out of his mind, pushed his thoughts back so far he thought they might vanish altogether. But his thoughts about Indigo, they lingered. Rob found a chair and sat in the corner, cradling a lukewarm glass of wine. He had just thought about getting a top-up when Susie flopped down on the chair beside him, fists clenched in the silky folds of her dress. "They're so disrespectful," she snapped, glaring around the room. "They're all whispering under their breaths. Did you hear she did that? Did you hear she fucked him? I want to punch them all in their stupid, inconsiderate faces. Why are you so goddamned calm?" Rob placed the glass of wine on the table beside him and ran a tired hand through his thinning hair. "I dunno, Suze. I mean, I'm no good at talking to people and saying things. If I'm going to do nothing, I may as well feel nothing." Susie was livid, her cheeks as red as the tomato on the table with the spread of cold cuts, cheeses, vegetables, and fruits. "Well, I'm fucking fuming. This is not right, Rob. It's just not right. It wasn't supposed to be her. It wasn't supposed to be like this." She gestured at the mourners mingling around the food. Several people had made their way down to the back garden and were laughing as they uncorked a fresh bottle of champagne. I'm just so tired of this happening, Rob," Susie said, leaning her head on Rob's shoulder. 2 thin lines of tears trickled down her left cheek. Her voice had lowered to a whisper. "When is it going to stop?" Rob closed his eyes. Indigo's feet dangled above him. Her mouth hung open, her eyes were open, yet seeing nothing. "I don't know, Suze, I don't know." Rob woke earlier than usual, beating his alarm by a solid hour and a half. He rolled onto his stomach and placed his arms under his pillows. The room had been repainted since he had last stayed. Once a light blue, it was now lime green, still as hideous as ever. Susie had never been one for interior design. His ears prickled at the knock on the door. "Come in. Just me." Susie pushed open the door and craned her neck around, peeking in at him. She had always done that, even when they were kids. When Rob turned 11 and their dad said it was time he had his own room, she'd wait for everyone to go to bed and poke her head around his door, wordlessly asking to lay down beside him. She'd never gotten over her fear of the dark. "Come on in." Susie smiled and bounded into the room, leaping onto the bed so her whole body covered the bed. Rob groaned at her weight. She smelled like vanilla and oranges. "You're such a child," he muttered, pushing her off him. She rolled beside him and got under the blankets. Her cold hands found him and she squeezed them, eyes not leaving his own. "Do you remember when you got that tent for your birthday, but it was winter so we couldn't sleep outside? So you put the tent up in the room yourself and we slept in it for weeks?" "Mm-hmm. And then Mum and Dad finally made us take it down?" "Yep, I remember." Susie sighed. "I wish it could be like that again, you know. Just us two being stupid. The kitchen is full of dirty dishes. The place looks like it's a victim of some wild New Year's Eve party. But what were we celebrating? Life? Death?" She placed her chin on his shoulder, and they remained silent for a few moments until Susie hit him over the head with a sequined necro cushion. "Get dressed and come downstairs. They're reading the will at 9. Rob nodded and closed his eyes. He felt Susie's soft hand in his hair and heard the door click shut. The voices downstairs were growing louder. He could hear Colin boasting about his latest achievements. It was always the same, year after year. Rob morbidly hoped he was next. Susie made them breakfast, omelettes the way Rob liked them. She was 28, yet he always saw her as his little sister, little Susie. Though they lived separately, they spent a lot of time together. A few people thought it odd, adult siblings seeing each other every day, but they actually liked each other's company. A tear reached Susie's lashes as she poured milk into the mixing bowl, and she hastily wiped it away. Rob frowned. His sister wasn't one to cry. "You don't have to hide it," Rob said. "It's not like it's some sort of secret. You can talk to me." Susie shrugged and put down the whisk. It rolled off the bench and landed on the linoleum floor at her feet. She looked down at it and sighed. "I don't know what to feel, you know. She had problems. We both know she had problems. But suicide? It just seems so unlike her. She had such intensity and drive to create things. She encouraged me, supported me, and now she's gone. They don't know how she died. She's just dead. It just seems so wrong. She wouldn't do that." People do all sorts of things when they're sad. Suicide can seem like a logical way out. Rob shrugged. He still didn't understand. People who committed suicide were supposed to show signs, weren't they? Self-harm, excessive drinking. He felt blue every now and then, but he had never felt anything so deep and destructive that it would drive him to take his own life. "Did she leave a note?" he asked. He hadn't looked for one when he had found her. Susie bent down and picked up the whisk and tipped the omelette mixture into the frying pan. At once the oil crackled and fizzled as the smell of egg heated the kitchen. "Sort of. Daniel said it was a bit cryptic, though. Nobody knows what it means. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. He gave it to me to see if I could figure out what it meant, but I've drawn a blank. It doesn't seem like anything she'd write, but who knows what she was thinking at that moment." Rob took a deep, pained breath, picturing her lifeless body. "Where was it?" "It was taped to the windscreen of her car. She left it in the parking lot at her work. Someone found it the next day after she had passed away." Rob nodded. Passed away. It sounded like passing through, as though she was just visiting someone and she'd be back. "So what does it say?" Susie raised a brow. "I'm telling you, it's weird. It makes no sense." "Yes, but what does it say?" Rob was impatient. He felt like Susie was keeping a secret he ought to know, that he was out of the loop somehow. But he had every right to know what Indigo had written. After all, they'd dated once upon a time, and they'd known each other since they were children. Susie nodded and left the kitchen, returning after a few moments with a small envelope. It was grubby, as though it had been left outside for days. Rob figured it probably had. She handed it to him and he clutched it tightly, wanting to protect it. Indigo had held this envelope, had penned its contents. It was hers. It contained the last remnants of her life. Rob pulled the paper from the envelope and began to read. L. Antoinette, Indigo, Rob. It'll eat us all one day. It's hungry, and it's coming. There's no turning back now, no turning back. Rob looked up at Susie. I don't get it. What's hungry? What did she think was coming after them? That's coming after you. Susie folded her arms and shrugged. Depression? I don't know. She reached for the spatula and flipped over the omelette. Rob pressed his hand to his stomach. He was hungry, yet the image of Indigo hanging from the extension cord would not abate. She hadn't looked like herself at all. She had looked like a mannequin made in her likeness. She'd looked like a doll, something you could buy from a shop. He shivered, wishing her eyes had been closed. Do you think it was all in her head? He asked Susie. His sister shrugged. I honestly don't know. But she was haunted by something no one seems to understand. Rob retrieved 2 plates from the rack and placed them on the bench. Susie flipped the omelettes onto them and placed the saucepan in the sink. She stared at them unblinkingly and leaned against the oven. You know what? I don't think I'm hungry after all. Chapter 2. Rob stopped at Indigo's house on the way home from work. He had avoided driving this way for a week, but today the traffic had forced him to take a detour. He pulled up to the curb and turned off the engine. Her house looked the same as it always had. She had lived at number 1 in the block of townhouses, right in front of the row of letterboxes. Her curtains were open and he could see her kitchen from the car. The plants by the doorstep were unwatered and had turned a light brown. He couldn't remember the last time he had visited. He'd been busy, as they all were. But now, that seemed like a lousy excuse. Had he missed signs? Had he tried to reach out? He couldn't remember anything specific. She hadn't asked for help. A tall, thin woman hobbled out of the complex and over to the letterboxes. Hunched, she looked perhaps 50, but could have been younger. Her face showed the faintest lines of age, yet she looked defeated, old. She and her clothing looked clean, yet she gave off an indefinable air of dirtiness that matched the suspicious sullenness of her face. The woman pulled out her key and jiggled it until her little letterbox door opened. Rob watched from the car as she pulled out a bundle of letters and carelessly tossed a few unwanted magazines and advertisements into a nearby bush. He was about to get out to ask the woman if she'd known Indigo, when she walked over to the front of Indigo's townhouse and peered through the window. Rob inhaled to shout at her to tell her to go away, yet he paused and held his breath. The woman seemed to be muttering something he couldn't quite catch. Hastily, she made the sign of the cross, spat into Indigo's rose garden and shuffled away. Hey you! Rob leapt out of the car and ran down the driveway to the letterboxes. The woman stopped and looked at him with a thin, raised brow. What do you want? Her voice was low and croaky, as if unused. What the hell was that? How dare you spit at her window? I ought to call the police. The woman's eyes were a murky brown, and she narrowed them as she took a step towards Rob, unintimidated. The police, huh? What are they gonna do, arrest me? Whatever. Rob raised his brows. He hadn't expected her devil-may-care attitude. He unclenched his fists, not realizing how tense he'd so quickly become. Biting down on his bottom lip, he looked over at Indigo's window. Did you know her? The woman followed his eyes and nodded. Sort of. I've lived here for 50 years. I get to know everyone. She was a bit weird. Rob looked at her. What do you mean, a bit weird? She wasn't weird. She was weird, the woman reiterated. I heard she killed herself. Not in the house, but somewhere else. She had all these weird friends come over in and out, at all hours of the night, all the time, and then poof, they disappeared for weeks, and then I heard she was dead. I didn't like her. Rob crossed his arms. I thought you said you only sort of knew her, he snapped. Sort of knowing someone doesn't allow enough time to form an opinion. The old woman rolled her eyes. Oh, calm down, I'm allowed to dislike someone, aren't I? Who are you, her boyfriend? I've never seen you round here. Rob pursed his lips and felt a sharp pang in his chest. I've known her for years. Well, I knew her for years. We met when we were kids. We dated other people, but it was always Indy and me. I guess I loved her. The woman huffed. Well, that didn't do you a lot of good, did it, love? What do you know about love? You're a baby. I'm 30, Rob protested. That's what I said, a baby. The woman scratched at her flaky neck and flicked something onto the ground. What are you hanging around here for? You can't just loiter around people's houses. Always weirdos out there and people trying to sell you things. Always travelling in groups like a pack of wolves. Don't know why people can't be left alone. I'm minding my own business. She waved her bundle of letters at him. You should be too. Now scat, go bother someone else. The woman hobbled away, muttering something under her breath. Before he could think of what to do, Rob followed her, the gravel path crunching under his feet. The woman stopped at a little cottage around the bend, the garden home to a dozen gnomes and fairies, all positioned in a neat and organized way. It seemed they were having a party. Don't you try and pinch those, she snapped as she opened the door. Rob chewed the inside of his mouth. Look, can I talk to you about Indigo? Could I perhaps come inside for a bit? I swear it won't be too long. I just wanted to talk to you. About what? I found her, in my house. I don't know how she got in. I hadn't seen her for ages, and then one day I come home and she was just there, dead, in my house. He ran a flustered hand through his hair. And then suddenly she was buried, and there was a wake, and I went back to work, and it's like nothing happened. It's like she never existed. And that note, it's so bizarre, so cryptic. It was like something was after her, and maybe it got her, the woman answered. She was a witch, after all. Her and the weird company she kept. Rob scoffed. Yeah, right. Yes, that's right. They all were. Maybe it got her. What got her? The old woman bit down on her bottom lip. I'm Evelyn. Come inside. I'll make us some tea. The house was dimly lit, though not unpleasant. Rob had expected dust-covered tables, mothball curtains, and maybe even a dozen cats. But the lounge room and kitchen were tidy, the dishes stacked on the dish rack beside the sink, the heater turned on, warming the small house, with socks hanging over it to dry. Old dressers and bookshelves lined the walls, and a stack of gardening magazines sat on a small wooden coffee table. There were no photos on the walls or anywhere he could see. An old fridge rattled loudly, and the soft sounds of wails came from a small CD player. Evelyn gestured for him to sit on an old lounge. The cushions sunk as he sat down, and he placed a small pillow behind his back. It's bloody cold outside, Evelyn remarked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The heater's been on for days now. Rob wanted to ask if she lived alone, if she had a husband or any children, but didn't think she'd be interested in answering. I offer you a drink, but I only have tap water and it doesn't taste very nice. Oh, I don't want anything, anyway, but thanks. Evelyn nodded. So, Indigo. She was pretty enough, I suppose. I had a little dog for a while, but I think it died. Oh, I didn't know, Rob answered. He crossed his legs. He wanted to take off his shoes and warm his feet by the heater, as they were a little damp from the earlier rain, but he thought it might be rude. She was strange, that one. She seemed nice at first, waving at me as she went to get her letters, but then, over time, she changed. She stopped waving at me. She looked tired. She stopped getting her letters. And then all sorts of strange people came over to her house in the middle of the night. Odd-looking people, all dressed in black. Rob nodded politely. 1,000 thoughts flitted through his mind. What the hell was this batty old lady talking about? What strange people? Indigo had worked at a fruit stand and sold her handmade jewellery at the markets. She read to seniors at the public library. Evelyn clearly knew nothing about her. She told someone she was a witch once. I heard her shout it at Bill, the complex manager. I think he was pulling her up on her wild gatherings, having too many people in her unit. She had an attitude problem when she wanted to. I think shouting something like that was a mistake, even if she truly believed she was. As I said, odd girl. Right. Rob rubbed his hands together. The heater was warm enough, though he was still chilled in the dank, lonely house. And they all listened to this awful music, Evelyn continued. Indigo went as far as to wear those weird necklaces, had a cancer symbol on it. The zodiac, not some capital C cancer. She hung a crab skeleton on her front door. It's gone now. Some guy took it a few days ago. Rob wondered if the woman was talking about the same person he was thinking about. Indigo kept to herself and liked to collect rare stones. She definitely did not hang animal skulls on her front door, and she'd never been into astrology. He remembered her pointing out groups of goths wearing all black who hung out in the valley on Saturday nights. She'd say they were vagrant and wondered if they had anything better to do with their lives. The old lady must have dementia. Grief swelled in Rob's chest as he remembered going to bars in the valley with Indigo and chatting about art. They'd start drinking in the city, but would always end up there. But Indigo had never done or said anything to make Rob think she visited the area without him. "You're wrong," he said to the woman. "How could you possibly say this? You didn't know Indigo at all." "You think I'm so old I don't know what I hear and see?" Evelyn asked brusquely. "That's what I heard and saw. I wouldn't make that crap up just to say awful things about the dead. It's what she did, and what I heard her talk about with her freaky friends." Rob folded his arms, and they sat in silence. Indigo had a history here, had friends over here, but nothing like Evelyn proposed. He thought they'd shared everything. They certainly had as they were children and teenagers, and even up until she'd died. A part of him ached for her, another part resented her. How could she leave him and not be here to defend herself against this nasty woman? How could he make sense of the world without her? She was his world and had been for as long as he could remember, even when they'd stopped dating. The old woman interrupted his thoughts. "She killed herself for a reason. She summoned something." Rob snorted. "Was it a ritualistic sacrifice too?" He stood up and walked over to the door. "You're a liar." Evelyn sighed and wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "I'm many things, boy, but I'm not a liar," she snapped. "If you don't want to hear the truth, then be my guest and leave. I'm not stopping you." She stood up and pointed to the door. "Go on then, get going." "I fucking will." Rob marched over to the door and pulled it open. The screen slammed against the brick wall of the house. Evelyn followed him to the door as he walked down the little pathway. "A demon got her!" she shouted. "She was haunted by it. She messed around with things she ought not to have. The rest of her freaky friends will succumb to it. You mark my words." "Piss off, you old bag." Rob stormed off over to the front of the complex and stopped at Indigo's townhouse. It was the same as it had been half an hour before. He crossed his arms. What kind of people had she gotten involved with that Evelyn would think she'd be into such voodoo crap? Sure, her suicide note had been ambiguous, but she wasn't in the right frame of mind when she'd written it. "It'll eat us all one day. It's hungry and it's coming." It was about depression, as Susie had said. It was her depression that was hungry, that consumed her, nothing else. Maybe she was ashamed of it and had told the woman she was a witch as some kind of joke. He knew parents who said that to their children to make them behave. She'd always been funny. Rob checked the time on his phone and returned to his car. It was only 5 p.m. He turned on the engine, resolute he had got to the bottom of this. Chapter 3. Rob lived in an old mustard-yellow fibro house 2 suburbs away. It had taken him longer to reach it due to the late afternoon traffic, people coming home from work, and by the time he pulled up to the curb, the sun had begun to set. He went inside and flopped on the leather 2-seater lounge and turned on the TV. Nothing was worth watching. He made himself a sandwich and flicked through his emails on his phone. Nothing important. He frowned, suddenly aware of how abysmal his life had become. No stable girlfriend, a job he wasn't that fond of, quiet nights alone at home. What was the point of it all? After finishing his sandwich, he decided to have a shower. He stood in the cubicle for what felt like hours, throat aching with the need to shed tears. I could live alone forever, he thought. Move to a small house at the end of a winding road where no one would ever find me. He pictured himself standing on the doorstep of a grand old house in the country, without work, without worries. I could live there, he thought aloud, and have a fireplace in the winter where I can dry my socks after it rains. He smiled. He'd have cats, too, 5 of them, and they'd all have silly names like Socks or Pepper. A single tear escaped his eye. He got out of the shower without ever turning it on. The bathroom was silent, and for a moment the weight of the silence fell upon him, until all he could hear was the quickened beating of his own heart. It is foolish to have such dreams, the sly voice taunted. Pull yourself together, he muttered to himself. Stop being a fucking baby. He'd gone to Indigo's house for answers, and instead left more confused than ever. He knew nothing would bring Indigo back, but talking about her with Evelyn, despite how insane she'd been, had been somewhat helpful. Just to talk about Indigo, to repeat her name, had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Friends left their condolences on social media, yet their sympathy seemed shallow and phony. Rob knew he had to move on and savour the memory of her as she was, but he couldn't push away the nagging feeling there was something he was missing. He leaned against the wall, thinking of Isaiah, her old high school friend. He knew they hung out sometimes, and she helped out on his little farm, just out of town. Maybe he'd have some answers. Rob ran the towel over his dry body, wincing as it scratched against his skin, and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. While the room was tiled on the floor and around the sink, without any cracks or marks, it suddenly looked old, ugly. He suddenly felt old and ugly himself. Dissolved, as though his body no longer belonged to him. Does it? Rob jumped, dropping the towel. It fell in a pile at his feet. The voice was so clear, as though belonging to someone outside his mind, though he knew he was alone. The house was empty, save for him. Is it? Rob looked down at his body. His skin was red raw, as though he had been whipped. Pressing his hands to his temples, he went into his bedroom, and fell onto the bed, naked, unaware of how dirty he was. He looked up at the cobwebbed canopy. It hung defeated, dipping in the middle. He looked to his left. 2 dark green curtains hung over the large window, with a bedspread folded over the heater to the left. The walls, dark oak wooden panels, were blemished with deep scratches. The ceiling was decorated with blue floral prints encircled by small, delicate wreaths. The room, though decorated nicely enough, seemed to be slightly askew. His eyes darted around the walls. They seemed sloped inwards, only a fraction, but noticeably sloped. Rob folded his arms in his lap. The room felt bigger than usual. Or he felt smaller. He wasn't sure. He got under the blankets and rolled on his side, facing the wall, and stared at the painting that hung on the wall. His mother had painted it herself for his 25th birthday. He narrowed his eyes. The trees were bent, as though an invisible wind tried to push them out of the frame. The clouds were painted on an angle, the birds flying towards the ground. Rob frowned. The longer he stared at the painting, the more it seemed like the trees were looking at him. Shaking his head, Rob rolled onto his stomach, pulled the blanket over his head, and closed his eyes. It's not real, he told himself. None of it is real. Tomorrow it'll all make sense. Tomorrow... The following day, Rob found himself standing outside Indigo's townhouse once again. Work had been the same as it had always been. The same as it ever would be. A government job provided a stable income, but he didn't want to stay there forever. It was no-nonsense work, the type of work that he liked, with questions that always had answers. He had taken it to care for his invalid mother. Physiotherapy and 24-hour nurses were more expensive than he'd expected. He'd never admitted it to anybody, least of all to Susie, but he resented his mother's disability, and he could never genuinely remember being happy in all his life. Instead, his stomach twisted in uncomfortable guilt, devoted reproaches, and shame. Shame that wished his mother would just die already. Shame he wished it was she he had found hanging instead of Indigo. You again! Rob turned to see Evelyn hobbling over to him, the same shawl she had worn the day before wrapped around her knobbly shoulders. She held a cigarette between her thin fingers. Rob smelled the familiar scent of marijuana. He raised a curious brow. For my back, Evelyn snapped. The medication is fucking useless. Whatever floats your boat. Evelyn took a drag and gestured at him non-committedly. What do you want? Come to snoop around again, have you? I assumed you wouldn't be back. Rob dug his hands into his pockets. Yeah, well, I am. Just leave me alone, okay? I ought to tell you to fuck off. You're nobody's guest. You're trespassing. I could call the cops. Rob breathed an exaggerated sigh. Listen, I'm not here to annoy anyone. I'm just here because I want to know what happened to my friend. Now, I don't believe in your wishy-washy satanic crap, nor that she sacrificed animals, but yes, I must admit it's all a bit strange. I just want to know why she did what she did. I never said it was satanic. I said a demon got her. There's a difference. Besides, she wore the symbol for cancer, the zodiac sign. That's got nothing to do with the devil. Although, cancer is a dark sign. Milton described it as black with no eyes. Sounds like a demon, don't you think? Rob pursed his lips. Even though the old woman was out of her mind, she was the only lead he had. Nobody wanted to talk about Indigo's death, not even her friends, and Susie wasn't interested in finding out more about the strange note. She'd told him to move on, but he couldn't. Everyone he had asked didn't know anything about the new people she started hanging out with. They had accepted she was depressed and simply committed suicide. But he couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't that clear-cut. There were other people besides Indigo who died, Rob said. A few of our friends. It all happened one after the other. They'd all hung themselves or slit their wrists. But they were happy, you know? Well, they seemed happy. My sister thinks they were all just depressed, but it can't just be a coincidence, can it? Evelyn shrugged. People become calm before they kill themselves because they know it will all be over. They seem happier than ever. Their improvement is only on the surface, while deep inside they're not really better. I worked as a nurse in the emergency ward for 30 years and I attended to a shitload of people who attempted it. Some were relieved they'd failed, others not. Oh, Rob nodded and looked down at his shoes. They were dirty and scuffed. He couldn't remember the last time he had bought new ones. He looked up at Evelyn. But you said Indigo was acting weird. Isn't that a contradiction? The woman shrugged. Maybe, but honestly I just thought she was a bit of a freak. Rob bit down on his bottom lip. Yeah, well, she wasn't. People just get sad. They act weird, but that doesn't mean they're slaughtering sheep in their spare time. Evelyn looked at him pointedly. Maybe she was. You don't know that. She held out the cigarette to him. He shook his head. He needed a clear head to solve the puzzle. If it is a puzzle, he thought. Evelyn shrugged. Suit yourself. She took another drag and blew it in his face. You're uptight. Rob coughed. And you're rude. Whatever. Now are you going to listen to me, or are we just going to stand here chin-wagging? I haven't got all day. My shows will be on soon, and then I'm going out with Mary for late-night bingo. Rob looked over to Indigo's townhouse. It looked abandoned, as though someone had packed their bags and left without warning. He supposed that's what people who committed suicide did. They abandoned things. They abandoned themselves. He turned to face Evelyn. Yeah, all right, I'll come inside. Once again, the lounge room was warm, and though it was cold outside, it wasn't any less unwelcoming as it had been before. Rob sunk into the lounge and crossed his arms. He was tired, more so than usual, but the past few days had been so overwhelming. He'd found Indigo's body, They'd had the funeral, then the wake, and now he was in the lounge room of some psycho. Only 5 days had passed. 5 long days that felt like weeks. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, finishing her joint. Want a drink? Something stronger this time? Rob nodded. What do you have? Rum, scotch, vodka, take your pick. Rum, please. No ice. I wasn't going to put ice in anyway. She made their drinks in silence, then returned to the lounge room. Rob smacked his lips, not realizing how thirsty he had been. Evelyn sat down and sculled half her drink at once. Indigo. Indigo. It all happened within a matter of weeks. She started acting strange and then became stranger and stranger until she died. It was like she became an entirely different person. Rob nodded and took another sip. What do you mean? Well, her whole demeanor changed. It seemed like something was inside her, sucking the energy from her. I've known people all my life who are depressed and get worse over time, but this was different. I mean, demons don't just walk up to people and inhabit their body. They prey on people who are already weak and open for possession. And that's what happened to Indigo. It's a bloody truth. Rob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Do you think that happened to the others? Evelyn finished the rest of her drink. Most definitely. Just as a flower needs a certain environment to flourish and grow, so does a human soul and the body. You put it in a harsh environment, deprive it of what it needs, then it will deteriorate slowly and eventually, poof, it dies. Rob placed his empty glass on the coffee table. But she didn't do anything like you see in the movies. She didn't start cursing or speaking in tongues. She didn't stop showering or piss herself. She didn't cut herself. I saw her naked body. It wasn't disfigured. Changes can appear without being noticeable. Just small things, things I saw. Rob scratched his head, trying to think of anything out of the ordinary Indigo had said or done. She'd been sick for a few weeks, a common cold, she'd said. He had seen her carry around tissues, and she'd looked a little pale, but nothing that would make him think she was seriously ill. Okay, so what if she'd been a little under the weather? He asked. That shouldn't ring alarm bells for possession. Evelyn cradled her empty glass as she finished her joint. She blew the smoke in Rob's face. Well, that's something. We both have proof of her acting differently. We can't ignore that. It's not like she wore a sign around her neck saying, I am possessed. You gotta look closely, gotta look at the facts. And the facts are she started hanging around people who looked like vampires, wore a pentacle, hung an animal's skull on her door, and knew other people who also topped themselves, seemingly out of nowhere. Who in their right mind, who had never done anything like that before, had never shown any signs of being depressed, of being a freak, would commit suicide? Huh? You tell me, maybe she was a witch, and maybe she wasn't. But she was possessed, and that's that. Rob looked around the room and rubbed his hands together, then interlocked his fingers as his gaze fell on Evelyn. She wore an expression that said, I told you so. Let's say she was possessed, he said. Let's say it's all true. What am I supposed to do about it? Evelyn dropped the finished cigarette in the ashtray and tapped the tips of her fingers together. Nothing. You just have to hope it doesn't come after you. Rob looked over at his empty glass, thinking. He was miserable. He was angry, but he wasn't going to leave without answers. He decided to go along with the woman to see how far she'd take her wild fancies. So, she killed herself because she was possessed. Yep. You see, people round here started acting real strange after she brought those weird folks home with her. People got scared. We were all scared. This used to be a tight-knit little community, but not anymore. They were talking about getting it gated, but nobody wanted to lock it in. Lock what in? Evelyn shrugged. Can't really say for sure, but people have been getting sick, stopped watering their plants, and the kids have stopped playing in the pool. Didn't you notice how quiet everything is? How cold? I've tried to get people to come over to see what it's like, but I don't really talk to anyone anymore. And who'd want to talk to me? I can't afford to leave this place. I've got nowhere else to go. Rob sighed. He felt sorry for the poor woman. Loneliness was a debilitating disease. He didn't know how to help her. He didn't have a cure. "Look," the old woman said matter-of-factly, "I've said all I'm gonna say on the matter. You best leave here and never come back. I don't know anything else. Just don't hang around here. Whatever got them, whatever got her, it'll get you too." Rob stood up and looked down at the cigarette stub, wishing he'd taken Evelyn up on her offer. Back pain, right. He wondered what he could get for confusing existential crisis pain. "You off then?" Rob nodded. "I'm going to take a look inside her house. I still have a key. I can't stop picturing the way she looked. I thought I screamed, but it was all in my head." He put his hands inside his pockets and curled his fists, digging his nails into his palms. "Well, I'll be here," Evelyn said, showing him to the door. "Just don't come bothering me too often. People might see it as an invitation to say hello to me as I'm getting the mail." Rob smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." Chapter 4. Rob stood outside Indigo's door and looked up at the sky. The sun had gone down while he had been with Evelyn. The pinkish hue of the horizon was peppered with patches of deep neon blue. The shadows grew larger as the thin fingers of darkness stole the remaining remnants of the day. He pulled open the screen door and lifted the back of the door knocker. Years ago, Indigo had glued a magnet to the back that held her spare key. Gotcha. Rob let out a deep exhale of victory. At least some things never change. He turned the key over in his hand. It was small and cold. Susie's low voice rattled around in his mind. I'm just so tired of this happening, Rob. When is it going to stop?" He opened the door, stepped inside, and flicked on the light. The house reeked of loneliness. Rob stared at the abandoned artifacts of Indigo's life and inhaled the stench of lemon-scented bleach. Despite the odor, there was a natural softness to the living room, to the kitchen, that made him feel welcomed. He had expected to be repelled by the house, but instead he wondered why he had spent all that time with Evelyn. Indigo's violet two-seater sat in the middle of the living room facing the 3 bookcases that lined the brick wall. Her shoes were neatly stacked under the window. An unfinished book sat on a small white ottoman. Rob picked it up and flicked through the pages. The bus on Thursday. She was halfway through. He turned it over and looked at the library barcode. He wondered who would return her books. Had the library been notified of her death? Rob had no idea who else needed to know. The post office? The local grocer? Who else would mourn her death? Indigo had built a life for herself, had been someone. Once. As the days passed, who would notice her absence? He looked over at the little kitchen. The cabinet doors were shut, the dishes dried on the rack. Containers of spices sat neatly on a biscuit-coloured microwave. 4 shot glasses perched on the windowsill next to a cactus. Why did you choose to end your life in my kitchen and not your own? He still didn't know how she'd gotten into his house. She'd given back her key years ago. He returned the book to its place on the ottoman and moved to stand at the bottom of the stairs. Rob had never liked stairs. He knew his fear was irrational, but he had never grown out of it. Walking was like breathing. It was an automated process that just happened harmoniously. Yet whenever he thought about walking up or down stairs, his conscious thoughts took over and his steps became mechanical. He had to think and plan every stride, every step. It irritated him to the point of nausea, and he would bound to the nearest lift. Yet there was no other way up. Rob took the stairs one at a time. Why bother? His mind whispered. Why even try? What are you trying to prove here anyway? He thought of Indigo walking up these stairs. What was she now? A daydream, a memory, a secret? He reached the top and pressed his hand to his heart, catching his breath. He felt like he had sprinted down the road. His body was tired and worn. You're only a baby, "Shut up, Evelyn," Rob muttered. He turned left and pushed open Indigo's bedroom door. What the fuck? The entire room was covered in newspaper. The walls, the carpet, the ceiling, the mirror, everything. Indigo's mattress had been flipped on its side and slashed open. Several knives and assorted cutlery protruded from the walls. Dozens of candles littered the room, some on their sides, drowning in wax. Mountains of black clothing lay in piles like clumped, tattered hair. Printer paper lay scattered everywhere, the names Elle and Antoinette covering them in childlike scrawl. Old chicken bones sat in small piles like anthills. Wrapped around one was a small piece of paper, a note. Rob bent to retrieve it. "The chewing hurts my food." Jesus. Rob dropped the note and slid down the wall, sitting against it, his back straight. This wasn't Indigo. Whoever lived here had not been his friend. Pinching his nose, he let out a deep sigh and cast his eyes to the left. Fucking Christ! Rob leapt to his feet faster than he'd ever done so in his life. "Had a little dog for a while, but I think it died." The little corpse was almost mummified, its body a brownish-grey hue. Its teeth were still white, open as if the dog had died with a smile. Though it was emaciated and skeletal, Rob imagined what it had been like in life. Vivacious, loyal, everything a dog should be. Rob was overcome with emotion. How had the dog ended up this way? Surely Indigo had not abandoned it. Unless... Rob shook his head resolutely. The crone was wrong. Indigo would never deliberately hurt an animal, much less sacrifice it. She was a kind and generous person. Was a kind and generous person. Before she died. He resumed his place on the floor, hunched over his knees. Had he ever known Indigo? Properly known her? They had always been close even after they stopped dating, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a hidden diary full of secret ambitions and unrequited love. This was insane. Killing an animal was cruel and heartless. Words he would never have imagined associating with Indigo. And yet here was the proof, right before his eyes. Unless something really had taken over her. Rob shook his head. The idea was preposterous. There were no such things as demons or spirits or possession. Ouija boards and tarot cards and fortune tellers were a scam. They were all make-believe. He looked over at the dog. You poor thing. The animal had suffered a terrible fate. He felt somewhat responsible. Had he kept in touch with Indigo, maybe the dog would still be alive? Rob got to his feet. He was tired and needed a shower. He needed to wash the day away. He took one last look at the chaotic room, at the sad, dead dog, and made his way downstairs and out of the house. The cold clung to his bones, so frozen it burned, touching him with the uncomfortable intimacy of a doctor's utensils. He got into his car and turned on the heater, though the unpleasant chill would not abate. "Why are you bothering with this?" his mind whispered. "What use is your investigation? What use are you at all?" Shut up, shut up, shut up. He pulled out off the curb and sped down the road, driving with the oppressive feeling something was watching him. He chewed the inside of his mouth, teeth gnawing away hungrily, as if he had never eaten anything in his life. The insatiable hunger clawed at him from the inside, pulled at his stomach, tearing at his insides so viciously he swerved to the left, hurling his car over the sidewalk and into a fence. The airbag blew up in his face and his neck snapped backwards, slamming into the headrest. As the car alarm rang shrilly in his ears, he closed his eyes and saw Indigo's body hanging from the extension cord. She outstretched her arm and beckoned with a smile. "Come to me, Rob. Come to me." "Oh, good, you're awake. About bloody time. I've got things to do, you know, places to be." Rob rubbed his eyes and stared up at the blurry image of Evelyn standing over him. The woman wore a long bottle green dress and short pink fur coat that hung just below her ribs. She clutched a blue handbag with the letter E stitched into the faded leather. Her hair was tied up in a knot at the top of her head, and she peered down at him behind half-moon glasses. I didn't know you wore glasses. Evelyn nodded and clicked her tongue. Well, you're fine. I'll be off then. You messed up my day already, almost running into me as I was minding my own business, taking a nice stroll down the road. Bloody rude, you know. You almost killed me, you twat. The audacity. She turned to leave, and Rob caught her sleeve. No, please, stay. Evelyn huffed and dramatically rolled her eyes. Fine. You're buying me a quarter. My back is killing me. She sat down and crossed her legs, taking off her glasses and putting them in her bag. She gestured to the bedside table. I've done all the crosswords in the magazine I nicked from the shop, so have fun reading the shitty horoscopes. More like horror-scopes. I swear they get worse and worse every issue. Ridden by a horse with opposable thumbs, most likely. Rob grinned. However annoying the woman was, she was certainly entertaining. Stop smiling, she snapped. You look like a duck. Rob rubbed his forehead. How long have I been here for? What happened? 3 days. You drove through the fence. You've been asleep since you got here, snoring away like a lawnmower. There were times I was tempted to smother you with your pillow just to shut you up. Sounds good. Rob stretched and sat up, rearranging his pillows behind his back. I drove through a fence. Shit. Your car's fucked, Evelyn stated matter-of-factly. You may as well drive it into a paddock and set it on fire. That sounds dumb. Something a dumb person like yourself would do. Rob rolled his eyes and stretched his arms over his head. Indigo. His stomach dropped. He looked at Evelyn, who peered at him curiously like he was some kind of deformity. She was there. On the road, I saw her. Evelyn nodded and crossed her arms. What did you find in her house? A dog, but it was decayed, deformed, mummified. Oh, so that's what happened to the mutt. Thought the weirdos got it. All cut up? Rob shook his head. No, just mummified. I mean, I've never seen anything mummified in real life, but I've watched shows about ancient Egypt and pharaohs. Probably sacrificed. Rob shrugged. I found the dog in her room. It was trashed, crap everywhere, clothes and candles and chicken bones. It smelled awful. Looked like it had been looted or squatters had been there. But it hasn't been unoccupied for too long. Someone must still be paying her rent. Evelyn pursed her lips and nodded. One of her freaky friends. The demon is probably still in the house. The place should be burned and salted. Maybe it got them. Dunno. Rob crossed his ankles. I'm still not convinced, though. I mean, yeah, it's weird, but a demon? I don't know. Oh my God, you're useless. Evelyn picked up her handbag and whacked him over the head. Rob protested and gave her the finger. What did you do that for? 'Cause you're an idiot. The signs are there and you know they're there, but you're trying to convince yourself they're not. This isn't something where a blind person can convince themselves they can see. This is real. You... Rob raised a curious brow. You don't know my name. Well, you never gave it to me, Evelyn snapped. He grinned. It's Rob. What a dumb name. Rob heaved a sigh and arranged his blankets. So did the doctors say anything to you about how long I'd be here? Evelyn nodded. Yeah, they should release you soon. The doctors said they were just waiting for you to wake up. You didn't sustain any real damage, unfortunately. Oh, bully for you. Evelyn rolled her eyes. So, what are you going to do about the demon? Let's say there really is a demon. I guess I need to exorcise it. Know any priests? I do, actually. Father Jacob. I tried to get him to see Indigo, but he said he couldn't get permission from the local bishop. They just said it was mental illness, but they're wrong. Father Jacob knows how to distinguish between mental illness and possession. He's not an amateur. Well, okay then, but can't he just do it? It's not like the bishop would know unless someone told him. Evelyn scoffed. God would know, obviously. In any case, he said he could get into all sorts of trouble if the exorcism wasn't sanctioned. And I'm not one to encourage trouble, so we let it be. I don't want the real estate company to find out we held an exorcism in one of their properties and kick me out. And I'm not going to be stuck on the streets becoming a beggar and asking for food vouchers and boxes of bread from the local community centre. Fine then. The curtain opened and a nurse poked her head through, smiling at them both. She was tall, blonde, and chirpy. Oh, you're awake, and you're still here, Evelyn. How kind of you. Rob, your aunt really is a treasure. The nurse checked Rob's blood pressure and smiled. Now, you don't have any broken bones or any other signs of injury. You might need to see a chiropractor, but you should be fine. We'll release you soon, but you'll need to book an appointment with your GP, just to make sure everything's okay. There'll be some bruising, but otherwise the doctor will be around this afternoon for one last checkup, and to make sure one last time you don't have a concussion. And then you'll likely be discharged. How's that sound? Rob smiled. Great, thanks. And I'm feeling fine. A little sore, but rested. That sleep did me well. Good. Well, I'll be on my way, and if I don't see you again, take care, hon. Nice to meet you, Evelyn. Thanks again. As soon as the nurse left, Evelyn stuck her finger in her mouth, miming vomiting. I bet she smiles and apologizes to the ground when she trips. Honestly, you're the worst person I've ever met in my entire life. Evelyn rolled her eyes and picked up the magazine. The world would be a better place if the airbags hadn't worked. Chapter 5. Rob spent a few days at home on sick leave before returning to work the following week. His colleagues had left chocolates and get-well-soon cards on his desk, wishing him a speedy recovery. He spent the hours at home concentrating on catching up with reports and emailing the local MP. He needed to finish organising the SES Volunteer of the Year award ceremony. Thankfully, his supervisor got him up to speed, and by Friday he had turned in the final program for the evening. He left his mother's house feeling tired but accomplished. She'd been in a good mood for once and hadn't soiled herself on command. Rob knew she did it because he always cleaned it up, but for once the visit was quick and surprisingly uneventful. He drove home in good spirits and stopped at the bottle shop to pick up some rum. He got home and kicked off his shoes, changed, sat on the lounge and checked his Facebook. Jennifer had had her baby. Daniel had signed up to run in the Bridge to Bridge marathon. A memory from Elle's memorialized profile page. In the silence of the house, I feel you beside me. You never left us, you never will. When is it going to end? Rob threw his phone across the room. It skidded and landed at the foot of the door. He stared at his hands as though he had touched something dirty. She had written the poem a few days before she killed herself. Everyone had commented saying how morbidly beautiful it was, how elegantly sad. Nobody had known it was a prelude to her death. Afterwards, people started asking themselves why they hadn't seen the signs. Yes, she had been withdrawn, but she was a poet after all. She was artistic. All artists were like that. Rob went into the kitchen and poured himself a drink, sculling it greedily. He poured another, sculled it. Then another. He cradled this one and returned to the lounge, staring at his reflection in the television screen. What use are you at work? His mind hissed. Everyone was happier when you were gone. No, they left cards. They care about me. Do they? And do you think a priest would really waste his time trying to help you? Don't fool yourself. Rob shook his head. Priests help people. It's what they do. Priests help people, it's what they do, his mind mimicked. You are undeserving of help from God. Why don't you do us all a favour and end God's suffering? He shouldn't have to waste his time dealing with you. But God helps everyone, does he? Rob pulled the woolen throwover over himself and laid down, nestling his head into one of the couch pillows. He gazed across the room and stared at his phone. Who would he call for help? And what kind of help did he require? Spiritual guidance? He wasn't sure what he was experiencing. His mind had inexplicably turned on him. Thoughts of Father Jacob, a man he envisaged being tall and thin and insect-like, swam around his mind. He imagined the priest pressing his thumb to his forehead, drawing the sign of the cross with holy water while mumbling incantations from an ancient religious text. And what happened after he was cured? Would he, Father Jacob, and Evelyn sit around the coffee table, hands joined, singing Kumbaya? He rubbed his shoulders. He was still sore from the accident, though grateful he hadn't sustained any serious or life-threatening injuries. When he thought of the car crash, his mind instantly thought of disaster movies where semi-trailers ploughed through cars, minding their own business on a motorway. There'd be fire and screams and semi-naked people on fire and screaming, running around in circles. He couldn't imagine a car accident would entail him driving sober through a fence. "Keep drinking," his mind whispered. "You've earned it. Drive away. Get out of this place. Just drive anywhere. Go for a trip. Don't tell anyone. Just get in the car. Indigo?" Rob wiped a line of saliva from the corner of his mouth. He was sure he'd heard her. Was his mind playing tricks? Or had a memory sprung forth, claiming substance? He reached for the remote control and turned on the television. There must be something to distract him. He flicked through the channels, his eyes relaxed, so everything became a blur. A whirl of colours and sounds merged into one ball of light that became almost blinding. Gasping, he closed his eyes, dropped the remote, and like a scared child, pulled the blanket over his head. Rob could hear the beat of his heart pulsating within his ears. It bellowed like a gong reverberating within an empty cathedral. Each strike a sharp stab to the neck. A whirl of words and sounds converged within his head, floating in and out of his ears. "No one likes you. Is it any wonder you're alone? Your friends died to escape you. Nobody wants you anymore. Nobody will miss you when you're gone." "Shut up!" His phone began to ring. The usual docile wind chimes became scissors, stabbing themselves through his eardrums over and over again. Rob winced, trying to push it away. His sister's voice spoke from the phone in an ethereal, gossamer tone, so thin he had to strain to hear it. "Rob? Rob, are you there? Where have you been? I've been calling you for days. I rang your office and they said you'd quit. Where the hell are you? You're being a dick and this isn't funny. Call me back." She's lying. "Rob, it's me again. Where are you? Nobody's seen you in weeks. Why aren't you answering? Why aren't you home? Where have you gone? Just fucking call me. Fuck." "Where are you, Rob? Why aren't you home?" "Fine. Ignore me. You're not the only one who's hurting, Rob. You're being selfish. I can't fucking believe you. I need you, Rob. I fucking need you. Call me." "She doesn't need you. She's the selfish one. She only cares about herself. She still has Indigo's necklace, the one she was supposed to give to you. She wants it for herself. She wants Indigo for herself. You are nothing and no one. You have no purpose in life. You are nothing. You have no job, no girlfriend, no friends. Your mother hates you and always has. Nobody would miss you if you died. Do everyone a favor. End their suffering." "Rob, it's me. I'm cold. I don't know where I am." Rob raised his brows at the soft timbre of Antoinette's voice. She had been gone for so long. He had almost forgotten the sound. He pictured her long, dark, wavy hair, the butterfly clip she always wore, and the vermilion lipstick that never left her lips. When was the last time he had seen her? Oh, yes, at her funeral. She had looked so peaceful, almost as though she was sleeping. Rob had prayed she'd wake up, but she never opened her eyes again. He closed his eyes and saw Indigo's feet. "Come to me, Rob. Come to me." Rob leapt from the chair, wrenching the twisted throw-over from his body. Sweat drenched his shirt and slid down his forehead. His cheeks burned and his heart beat so wildly he thought it would break through his ribs, break through his chest, and throw itself against the wall. He tossed the throw-over onto the ground and ran into his room, wrenching off his clothes. He dashed into the bathroom and turned on the shower, blasting the cold water as fast as he could. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the shower and under the water, scrubbing at his face. Was there something inside there? Slowly, ever so slowly, the corners of his eyes began to melt, like wax held to a hot flame. Little bugs crawled into his sockets as his eyeballs slid down the side of his face like a slippery slope. His teeth wiggled their way out of his gums and split out onto the floor, clacking loudly on the bathroom tiles. Rob screamed as his flesh tore away from his scapula and his humerus shattered. Speckles of skin, muscle, and bone shot out in the air and splattered across the bathroom, sending flecks of blood across the walls. Blood bubbled in his cheeks as his jaw stretched downwards as though lowered by an invisible lever. The sockets of his eyes pulled so far sideways his eyeballs fell from their place, hanging limply on the loose skin where his cheeks once were. The bathroom light flickered on and off. Scratches on the walls dug hard and sharp, peeling back the paint. The room shook. The shower door trembled. The glass shattered, sending mirrored spears through Rob's chest. He dropped to the floor and landed on his back, limbs akimbo. He blinked once, twice. His body was intact. "Come to me, Rob. Come to me." Rob closed his eyes. Rob opened his eyes. The grass was wet beneath him, twisting in the afternoon wind like sea snakes slithering through a creek. A dark, crumbly cloud moved across the sky, settling about him low and full, as though it might burst at any moment. The giant mango tree in front of his house hung above him, the cold wind bristling their decayed leaves like agitated whispers. He could almost taste the mangoes. They would be not quite ripe yet, but soon, he told himself. Soon. He rolled onto his side. The house was quiet, still. The garden bed was unattended. Weeds shot up like spikes. When was the last time he had mowed? Hey you! Rob sat up. His neighbour, Jacob, stood over him, scratching his crotch. "You drunk?" Rob rubbed his eyes. "No." "High?" "No." "You sure?" "Yes." His neighbour rolled his eyes and nodded. "Right. Well, you've been laying there for a while now. I don't know what's going on, but you should probably go inside or something. You're starting to scare the kids." Rob rubbed the back of his neck. It was sunburnt. "How long have I been here?" The man shrugged. "A few hours. Did you have a seizure or something? Or is it the drugs? 'Cause I won't call no one on you." Rob sat up and stumbled to his feet. He brushed bits of grass from his pants and looked around. A group of teenagers passed his house, looking down at their phones to avoid him. "What people?" "You know what I mean. Just keep it down. I got kids." "Yeah, all right." His neighbour nodded and walked back over to his house, giving Rob one last accusatory glance before shutting the front door. Rob looked over at the teenagers and gave them the finger. He stumbled into the house, sludgily making his way over to the lounge. He collapsed onto it and took a deep breath. He didn't know how he came to be laying outside. He couldn't remember. In fact, he couldn't remember much of anything. First he'd had his accident, then he had taken time off, and then he had gone back to work. Hadn't he? When was the last time he had said good morning to Jane at the reception desk? When was the last time he had made Bryony laugh? He had turned in the final program for the SES Volunteer of the Year award ceremony, but he couldn't remember attending. Shit. He had been fired. He had definitely been fired. There was no other explanation. He'd been at home all this time, drunkenly wallowing in his own despair. That seemed like something he would do. He wondered if Evelyn had checked in on him. Evelyn. Keys. Rob looked around and found them on the kitchen bench. He scooped them up and slipped on his shoes and dashed out of the house, slamming the door shut behind him. The car was freezing, so he turned up the heater as high as it would go. At once, Sweat pooled in his collarbones, but he ignored it, backing out of his driveway as fast as he could go. Rob pulled into the complex and drove right up to Evelyn's house, parking his car on a patch of grass beside her cottage. He glowered at the gnomes and fairies as they enjoyed their party without him. He knocked on the door, calling out Evelyn's name. Evelyn opened the door and frowned at him. She wore a bright yellow caftan and a pink feather boa. Her hair was braided and piled on the top of her head. "What do you want?" Rob pushed past the dotty woman and strode into her house, pacing around the lounge room. He listened to the soft whistles of wails from the CD player. He knew they were supposed to be calming, but they did nothing but agitate him further. Evelyn shut the door. "Oh, invite yourself in, why don't you? Too fancy to ask. Ooh, la-di-da." "Shut up!" Rob exclaimed, fists clenched. "Just shut up! It's after me. I can feel it inside me." "You were right. Fuck, you were right. Fuck." He sat down in his chair and crossed his legs, agitated fingers tapping at his knees. "Idiot. I was so wrong, Evelyn. I was so wrong." He ran a shaking hand through his oily hair. He couldn't remember the last time he had showered or shaved. "I don't know what the fuck is going on, but it needs to stop. It can't be real. I'm imagining things. I must be." "Are you?" Evelyn sat down and peered at him quizzically through her glasses. "Do you think Indigo thought she imagined things? Do you think she fully understood what was happening to her?" "I don't know," Rob snapped. "Do you?" Evelyn flipped one end of her boa over her shoulder. "I'm not sure. She just changed. She wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. And when she did, it was all like she couldn't see anyone at all, like her eyes couldn't focus. They were blank. And then some days she was happy. She smiled and said hello, but those days were far and few between. Eventually they stopped altogether until she became nothing but a husk of a person. I tried to help her. I tried to talk to her. Father Jacob and I both tried to help her, but there was nothing we could do. I spoke to him the other day. He doesn't want to help." "You mean he can't?" "No, I mean he won't." Rob wrung his hands and pressed down on his knees, digging his nails into his thighs through his pants. "What good is all this worry? Why don't you end it? You know how. You just have to do it. You're not a coward, are you?" Rob rubbed his hands against his cheeks, his fingers pressed into his skin, drawing circles. He closed his eyes slowly. His skin began to move. His lower jaw stretched downwards, and the skin from the top layer of his cheeks hung in thick, desquamated chunks, as if ripped apart by some kind of wolf or bear. His tongue lolled uselessly from his mouth, shredded and hanging like streamers. The sclera of his eyes became yellow, his pupils swelling until they covered his iris. Blood ran from the corners of his eyes, running down to his lips. Rob stumbled backwards, tripping over a pile of books. Evelyn stood from her chair, though she did not move. A soft bark echoed in the distance, becoming louder as it came closer. Rob turned to look towards the hallway and gasped. The little dog ambled towards him, its legs stiff, paws dragging along the carpet. Its teeth were pointed and yellow, though its jaw was askew, as though it was smiling. It pulled its stiff legs towards him, its jaw widening so the smile seemed almost human. Rob scrambled backwards, bumping into a dresser. A mountain of photographs and yellowed newspapers tumbled down, landing on him with the force of an anvil. The weight knocked the air from him, and he gasped, breathing nothing. Rob looked up at Evelyn. She stared at him with pity, her arms crossed loosely against her chest. "Get that thing away from me!" "I can't help you," she replied simply. "I can't see what you see." "Get it away!" Rob bellowed. The dog grew larger, its size growing so immensely it almost filled the entire room. It towered over him, its mouth hung open, hungry. Rob raised his hands to his cheeks and gasped. His skin was smooth, reformed to fit his face. He rubbed his eyes, and when he opened them, The beast of a dog was gone. He stumbled back to the front door, panting so hard he thought his heart would burst from his chest. "You," he mumbled, pointing a shaking figure at the woman. "You're doing this. This is you." Evelyn raised a brow, her lips pursed. "Is it?" she replied simply. "Or is it after you? Has it latched itself onto you as it did to Indigo? Do you feel it within you, devouring you? I warned you," she said, pointing her finger at him. "I warned you." "She doesn't care. She never did." The cruel voice wrapped itself around his mind. "When was the last time you heard from Susie? She's forgotten about you. They've all forgotten about you. When was the last time someone genuinely cared for you? When was the last time someone pressed their lips to your neck, wrapping their arms around you? You liked Jane. You wanted her. But she didn't want you. And why would she? You're pathetic." "Fucking stop it!" Rob pushed open the front door and stumbled outside. The sunlight was almost blinding. After so many dark hours inside the house, it seared into his eyes, until all he could see were speckles of black and white, like little lights dancing before him. He rubbed his eyes, though the harder he rubbed, the more his vision blurred. He wondered, for a second, what it would feel like to die. The feeling touched him with such unpleasant intimacy. He felt it rattle within his soul. He took a deep breath, inhaling not air but a rotten sweetness that lingered within his nose, sliding down his throat until it filled his stomach. "Just leave me alone," he gasped, falling onto the grass. "God, take this wretched feeling away from me." He closed his eyes, wrapping his arms around his knees. "Take it all away." Evelyn followed Rob outside and stood over him. A thick gloop of oil spilt out of her mouth, sliding down her chin. It ran down her chest, slid down her legs, and snaked towards him, stopping at his feet. "I told you it'd get you. Goodbye, Rob." "In here!" Rob spun around. A short man around his own age stood outside Indigo's house, pointing to the open door. Underneath his grey beanie, his head was shaved, his face obscured by a scraggly black beard. He wore a faded black t-shirt and ripped cargo pants. A cigarette hung from his fingers. "Come on!" Without hesitating, Rob sprinted over to the house, and with one last look at Evelyn, ran inside, slamming the door behind him. Chapter 6. "Thought she was going to get you." Rob slid down the door and leaned against it, heart racing as though he had just run a marathon. The man went into the kitchen and returned with a beer. Rob accepted it greedily, sculling half the bottle before cradling it between his knees. He looked up at the man, noticing the garish silver pentacle around his neck. "She told me about you," Rob said. "Evelyn, I mean." He pointed at the necklace. "Does it protect you?" The man nodded. "For now, though it didn't protect Indigo. It got her in the end, just like the others." He peered through the window as though expecting someone or something to burst through the door. He was quiet for a moment, then turned back to Rob. "Why are you talking to her? You need to stay away." Rob frowned. "From who?" "Evelyn. You can't trust her. I warned Indigo, but it was too late. She lets them in. She's like a conduit. I'm not sure if she's aware she's doing it, but she definitely knows more than she lets on." Rob nodded and finished the beer. "Did you see it?" he asked warily. "Yes." The man walked over to the little blue sofa and sat down. Rob followed and sat on a grey armchair across from him. "It's what she saw, isn't it? And I saw her dog, but it's dead. And my face." He ran his fingers down his cheek. "I can't even begin to describe. The bugs..." "Don't worry, I know." The man outstretched his hand. Rob took it and they shook politely. "I'm Johnny. I knew Indigo. Evelyn probably told you some crap about me, about us and what we do. But we're not lunatics. We're not crazy devil worshippers. We're trying to guard each other. It's been picking us off one by one, jumping from host to host. We're trying to make it stop." Rob placed the empty bottle on a small glass coffee table. This is all so messed up. Are you all part of some kind of cult? I don't get it. What happened to Indigo? Why did she really kill herself? He ran his hands through his hair, tugging on the ends. Evelyn said I was possessed by the same demon that got Indigo, that made her kill herself. I feel things are happening that I can't explain. Things I'm starting to believe happened to Indigo. My head is so messed up. Dude, I can't think. I can't focus. I don't even know what day it is. And this voice, it speaks to me. I'm a fucking lunatic. Johnny tugged at his beard, then pulled his beanie down over his brows. His brown eyes were alighted with a mixture of intrigue and fear. 1. You're not a lunatic. 2. No, it's not a cult. And 3. I think Indigo killed herself not because Artemis told her to, but because it was the only way she knew how to escape it. She was defying it by doing what it asked, but on her own terms. Rob raised a brow. Artemis? Artemis, yes. The goddess of the moon and wilderness. You see, the ancient Egyptians identified Cancer as the scarab, one of their many sacred symbols of immortality. So that's why it's the symbol on her necklace. They were trying to find a way to become immortal, but it backfired, and Artemis came after them, one by one, finding ways for them to end their lives. But Indigo wanted a choice. She wouldn't back down. Johnny shrugged. Think of it as assisted suicide. She had reached the end of her life. She knew Artemis would be coming for her. It was a genuine and compassionate choice over the manner and timing of her death. Oh yes, because hanging yourself is a fabulous choice. Rob stood up and paced the room, tugging on the ends of his hair. Fear pressed upon him like a pillow over his face, snaking its fingers up his nose and into his body, crushing his organs one by one. You okay, man? You're as white as a ghost. Holy fuck! Rob leapt from the armchair and stumbled across the room, holding himself up with the staircase balustrade. Indigo stood in the kitchen, her hand gently massaging her throat. Bright purple blood marks covered her face and eyes, overlapping the pale blue pall of her skin. Her eyes, once a deep blue, were milky white, and a trickle of black goo snaked down her cheek and over her collarbone, stopping to rest between her breasts. Can you... She's right there! His hand shook as he pointed at her figure. Johnny looked, but his eyes were blank. Rob knew he could see nothing in the kitchen that ought not to be there, least of all the hideous spectre of a dead woman that had now outstretched her hand. What do you want? He shouted. Just leave me alone, I can't help you. Johnny moved to stand by Rob and took his arm. Come, sit down. His voice was gentle, one used with upset children. Rob took it as a slap in the face. She's right there! Indigo pointed straight at him, her cold eyes meeting his. Rob clutched his throat and coughed, gasping, pain shooting through his chest and down his arms. He doubled over, sweat pooling at his brows. Dude! Johnny grabbed Rob's shoulders and sat him down on the lounge, kneeling in front of him. He shook Rob's shoulders and peered into his eyes. What's going on? Speak to me. Does it have you? How long has it had you for? Father Jacob, Rob mumbled, lips barely moving. He gulped a lungful of air and exhaled slowly. I need Father Jacob. Who's Father Jacob? Johnny asked. Tell me what's been happening. Did this start after Indigo died? When? What exactly can you see? Rob looked at Indigo and she looked back at him, eyes rimmed with tears. He moved to get up, to confront her, but found he was incapable of doing anything at all. His entire body had frozen. He closed his eyes, seeing nothing but colours dancing beneath the lids, and shivered, suddenly overwhelmed by an intense coldness that pierced through his skin and gouged at his bones. And then he could feel it, there beside him, in the room with them both. Rob desperately tried to flee, to open his eyes, say something, anything, but he was pinned to the lounge, unable to free himself from the malevolent fear that coursed through his body, and the thing that was in the room with them, within him. Stay here, Johnny shouted. Just stay here, I'll be back. Rob listened as the man fled from the house. He took a deep breath, opened his eyes, and found himself face to face with Indigo. Instead of the hideous apparition she had become, She was beautiful. Her pale cheeks were pinched with pink, her smile wide as she flashed her hideous rings at him. She had loved those rings. She had loved their awkward ugliness, their gaudy-coloured gems. They looked cheap and were the type that'd stain your fingers green, but she'd worn them every day. Once she'd referred to them as her lucky charms. Rob wondered if she had known just how unlucky they'd become. "What are you doing here?" Indigo hissed. "Go away, she'll get you." "Indigo!" Rob's voice cracked as his heart thumped erratically against his chest. "Are you here, or is this all in my head?" Indigo knelt in front of him. She wore the same clothes he had found her in. They smelled stale, unwashed. She placed her hand on his chest. "She did it to us," Indigo whispered. "We were trying to make it go away, but she stopped our rituals from working, and now it's inside you." Rob shook his head, shivering. Her touch was icy, like the bitter onslaught of winter. The cold licked his face and spread under his skin, ferociously pulling the heat from his body. Indigo pressed down harder, pushing a maelstrom of cold and heat within him, so forcefully his entire body vibrated, shaking his very core. "You will never be the creme de la creme," the voice whispered. "But oh, to be the cream," Rob thought. "Oh, to be the cream." Rob fell sideways, one leg over the end of the lounge, one leg on the floor. Why had he never aspired to be something, someone? He had spent the past decade walking in and out of revolving doors, shaking hands with strangers. "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "3 bags full, sir." How abysmal his life had become. He had been sleepwalking through life, searching for but never finding the perfect dream. But what was the perfect dream anyway, he wondered. What did he actually want? He couldn't decide what haunted him most, Indigo or his utter detachment from the world. He ran his hands over his face, screaming as minuscule bugs fought their way out of his pores. "Wake up, Rob!" he bellowed, slapping at his face. "Wake the fuck up now!" For every bug he pulled from his face, 5 more appeared. He rolled onto the floor and pulled himself up to his knees, scratching at his face, his fingers soon covered in a paste of bugs and blood. Sweat pooled at his brows and ran down his face, dripping over his top lip. Instinctively, he stuck out his tongue and licked his lips, lapping at the mixture of sweat, blood, and bugs. Revolted, he regurgitated the mess, spluttering and retching in disgust. Indigo held his face between her cold hands. She gently kissed his forehead and drew a line with her finger across his neck. "You know what to do." "Stop! Rob, can you hear me?" Rob opened his eyes. Susie and Johnny stood over him, faces aghast. A pungent stench filled his nostrils, a mixture of sweet berries and lavender perfume old churchwomen sold at the markets. He was sitting on the landing at the top of the stairs. He'd wrapped the twisted cords and knotted sheets around the boards of the hot water heater, shut inside a narrow cupboard with a high ceiling on the landing. He pressed his hand to his neck, massaging his raw skin, and moved his hand around the back of his neck, pushing down on the top of his spine. The pain was blinding, but there was no way to alleviate it. He couldn't move. Rob told his legs to move, his arms to move, his hands to move, but nothing happened. He gasped a lungful of air and held it. His breath had become wet and raspy, quick and shallow, and he didn't know if he had stopped breathing altogether. A light twinge flickered in his right eye like the indicator light of a car. He told himself to touch his face to see if the bugs had gone, but his body refused to cooperate. He opened his mouth to speak, but his tongue had fused to the top of his mouth, and the only sounds he could make were unintelligible noises. "I'm calling the ambulance." Johnny pulled out his phone and Susie knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. Tears poured down her reddened cheeks. "How could you do this? You can't leave me, Rob. You just can't." Rob took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "She wasn't depressed, Susie. I don't know what it is, but it's after me too." Johnny bounded down the stairs and out the front door. Rob heard him shout his address and attempted suicide. He wanted to tell Johnny that he was wrong, that he wasn't trying to commit suicide. He wanted to say it was Indigo who was trying to kill him, but didn't have the energy to shout. "I'm sorry I ignored you, Rob," Susie said, wiping the tears from her eyes with the sleeve from her shirt. "I'm going to get you help. I shouldn't have been angry with you. I just didn't think you'd do something like this. God, I'm so sorry." "You need to leave," Rob croaked, "or somehow your name will be on the list. L. Antoinette Indigo Rob. It wants me. It's inside my core, but who's to say there won't be a new list? You can't take any chances, Suze." "You're not making any sense." "Johnny, where's the fucking ambulance?" "It's coming. Please, let go, Suze. I thought she was crazy, but I was so wrong, Susie. I was so wrong." "You're a failure," Indigo whispered in his ear. "You couldn't even kill yourself. Who are you to believe you're above it all? Look at you, safe within your house of cards and glass. You're weeping tears of self-pity. Accept this fate. There is no immunity. You are no stronger than the others." Rob looked down at his hands. The flesh in his palms had opened like flowers, the petals thick and moist, rivers of blood pouring onto the floor. He was both sickened and curious, and surprisingly calm. He looked up. Indigo hovered above him, held up by some invisible suspension. Her stomach opened, and a beam of heat escaped through the fissure, cocooning itself around Rob. He had never been spiritual in any sense, and had claimed himself an atheist, yet seeing her hovering over him caught his breath and made him wonder if he had been wrong to deny the existence of God for so many years. Her appearance was so extreme it must be sacred. She seemed almost holy as she stared at him, her head hanging limply, her eyes blank. Rob wanted to scream, wanted to shout, but he had come to a bizarre acceptance that for some unfathomable reason, be her apparition beautiful or monstrous, she had chosen to haunt him. But he didn't understand why. Why linger in a world you can no longer be a part of? "What are you trying to tell me?" he shouted. "What? Just tell me. I get it, you're haunting me. But I was already haunted, Indigo. I've always been haunted by the things I think and feel, and the things I can only hope will one day come true. I'm haunted by the things that I want to happen, but never will. So go away. You can't haunt me any more than I already haunt myself." "Here. He's in here. Oh God, I don't know." Rob looked up at Susie. She was hysterical. The screaming sobs only interrupted so she could wipe her red, tear-streaked face with the back of her hand and draw a breath. She sunk to her knees as two paramedics pushed past her and rushed up the stairs. "Get away," Rob mumbled. "She's down there. Evelyn's down there. A monster. She's going to kill me." "Rob, honey, no one's down there." "Oh God, is he going to be okay?" Rob looked up at the paramedics as they sat beside him on the stairs. There were two of them, a man and a woman. The man shone a torch in his eyes and waved his hand in front of his face. "My name is Russell. This is Laura. Your friend here says you need a bit of help. What's your name?" "Don't say a word. That's how they get you." "Can you tell me where you are, mate?" "Keep your fucking mouth closed." "Have you had anything to drink? Any drugs, prescription or non-prescription?" "You say a single word and I'll snap your sister's neck." "Can you talk to me? Can you hear what I'm saying?" Rob looked down at his hands. They were smooth and unblemished. He rubbed them together, wincing at the slightest feeling of friction. He took a deep breath and held it in his throat, releasing it slowly, counting back from 5 in his head. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. He had to get away. Rob looked down at his hands. They were his own, flesh and blood completely healed. He rubbed them together, the warmth of the friction flooding to his fingertips. He looked over to where Indigo was, yet all that was there was the empty space where she had stood moments before. He looked up at the paramedic. The man was checking his blood pressure. Rob sighed. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you, Indigo, but I don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do." He fell onto his back and stared at the roof. Hundreds of tiny crabs exploded from the corners of the ceiling, their legs twice as long as any he had ever seen. Their beady eyes shone like blackened pinheads, their pincers clicking loudly as they scurried towards him. Rob opened his mouth to scream. They jumped through the air and into his mouth, scuttling down his throat. "Rob!" Susie exclaimed. "Rob, what's happening?" Her voice sounded like an echo reverberating around the room. He closed his eyes, yet could still see the tiny crabs, could hear their strange dulcet purr. He dimly felt himself lifted onto a stretcher and into an ambulance. He opened his eyes. Indigo sat next to the paramedics, wearing a sad smile. "Don't let her get to you, Rob," she said as Rob began to lose consciousness. "She'll swallow you whole." Rob wrinkled his nose. The symphony of coughing, hacking, wheezing, and crying reverberated around the room. The smell of antibacterial hand sanitizer singed the hairs in his nose. Rob watched the scurry of bloody noses, scrapes, and surgical masks intertwine with tears, arguing, vomit, and vending machine food. He rolled onto his side. He was laying on his side on a bed in the hospital emergency room. "Back again, I see." The curtain opened and a nurse came into the hospital room. He recognized her as the same nurse who had attended to him after his car accident. She took Rob's blood pressure and clicked her tongue. "We've got to stop meeting like this, dear. Did you see your GP after last time?" Rob shook his head. "Well, that's silly. You could have been really hurt. Luckily, your aunt was there to take care of her. Such a lovely woman. You're lucky to have such a close relationship. I'm almost jealous." Rob sat up in bed, pushing the sheets off him, heart racing. "She's here? Evelyn's here?" "Yes, of course. She insisted on taking you home, but we can't release you just yet. You'll have to wait for the psychologist to speak to you." "Do you see a psychologist or a psychiatrist?" Rob shook his head. "How did I get here? Who called the ambulance?" "Oh, your friend Susie. Don't you remember? She's here too, with Evelyn, out in the waiting room." "No!" Rob leapt from the bed, tripping over the tangle of twisted sheets around his ankles. He scrambled to his feet and ran out into the waiting area, searching the sea of tired and anxious faces. The air was stuffy, filled with an undertone of bleach. The walls grew from the floor and stretched upward to the matching ceiling, lined with thin magnolia stripes, and scraped and scuffed in places from metal stretchers and exhausted individuals. Rob looked up, squinting at the abrasive light, then scanned the occupants in the room, searching for a familiar face. He spotted Susie and Evelyn standing by the water fountain. Susie looked old. Her lanky hair hung around her pale, blotched face. Rob felt a deep well of regret in the pit of his stomach. He was the cause of her distress. Evelyn turned and stared at him. "She has to go," the voice whispered. "She'll get to Susie next. You have to kill her." Rob stormed over to the fountain and grabbed Evelyn's shoulders, shaking her as hard as he could. "What the hell is inside of me? Get it the fuck out of me!" "Rob!" Susie wedged herself between them, pushing Rob aside. "What the hell, Rob? Nurse!" "Get off me!" Rob reached for Evelyn's neck, ripping the necklace from its chain. As soon as the metal touched his fingers, a resurgence of regret and reticent feelings poured into him, soaking him with every feeling, every sense, every thought Elle, Antoinette, and Indigo had ever felt. He felt their pain against his skin, snaking around his wrist and up his arm, pressing itself within him, filling him with such ferocious force he stumbled backwards, feeling the transfer so violently he felt physically ill. He looked up at Evelyn. But it was not her he saw, but a hideous scarab without any eyes. It reached for him, pressing its pincer into his stomach, emptying the little food Rob had consumed in the past few days. The contents spilt out onto the floor as the scarab crawled into his stomach, its limbs pressing against his spinal column, his back arching at an impossible angle, his knees twisting outwards, elbows twisting inwards so that his body became nothing but a bag of scattered bones piercing through his skin. He wished he could wake up and welcome the dry heat that came with the rising sun. He wished he could slip out of the sheets and make breakfast for Indigo and then leave for work for a job that made him feel old. Something normal. But this dawn was not like any other dawn, and Rob had the devil for company. and he clung to him fiercely like a lover's first kiss. Biting down on his lip, Rob wondered, what difference does it make? What difference does any of this make if they were always going to die? They were on the list. There would never be salvation. Come to me, Rob. Come to me. No. Sir, calm down, sir. Rob knew what he had to do. He knew how easy it would be. There were many ways to do it, even under the supervision of hospital staff. But there was a part of him drenched in cowardice, that knew he couldn't do it. He was the end of the line, yet he couldn't take his own life. He wasn't as brave as Indigo. He hadn't the strength. I don't care anymore, he muttered. I don't care. He threw his hands up into the air and stared at Evelyn. Do you hear me? You can't break me. Evelyn smiled sweetly at him, the kindly smile of a grandmother offering sweets to children. Oh, honey, it was never you I wanted. She turned to face Susie and wrapped her arm around the woman's shoulders. Come on, dear. We should let him rest. Evelyn gently steered Susie away towards the exit. Rob moved the chase after them, yet was held back by two doctors, who steered him back towards the bed. No, let go of me! She's going to get you, Susie! Please believe me, she's a monster! A single tear ran down Susie's cheek. She looked over her shoulder at him one last time before hurrying out of the hospital in tears. Evelyn stared at him and smirked, and he gasped, feeling a heaviness, a darkness leave his body. Though he could not see it, he knew it had entered Susie, that it was within her now, swimming around her darkest thoughts, waiting to float to the surface and swallow her whole. He was too late. It had expelled itself from him, relinquishing its control, in turn stripping him of any control he had ever had over it. He felt the absence so forcefully it seemed as though he had lost his oldest friend, and for a moment he felt what he knew Indigo had felt right before the parasitic demon had left her body and sought out his own. He felt the absence that had driven her to suicide. It wasn't the demon that had taken Indigo's life, it was the solitude it had left behind. Rob closed his eyes and saw Indigo's feet hanging lifeless from the roof. She had been strong, but not strong enough. He would not succumb. The end.